Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I know we'll have people who continue to roll in, but we are right at 2 p.m. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here today. Welcome to the second webinar in our series called Strategies to Reduce Environmental Cancer Risk. This part 2 is on promoting safer agriculture, and we've got a couple great speakers lined up for you today. My name is Kelly Wells-Sittig. My pronouns are she, her, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Iowa Cancer Consortium. We'd like to invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat. If you would, take a moment to do that. We have a lot of participants joining us from various areas of expertise from across the country. So for anyone new, the Iowa Cancer Consortium is the state of Iowa's comprehensive cancer control coalition. We are a network of more than 650 members of all sorts of backgrounds, occupation, experience, all working together to make cancer less of a burden in Iowa. We are a nonpartisan, non-political organization, and we do not use state or federal funds to engage in lobbying. And because of that, we always like to share that the opinions and the interpretation of information that are shared by speakers and attendees in our webinars or meetings or communications do not necessarily reflect the positions of the consortium, its board of directors, members, or staff. But we are so happy to have and be able to offer a platform for really great and really important discussions like the one that we plan to have today. The consortium's Cancer and the Environmental Task Force and the Environment Task Force is here to connect partners with resources, knowledge, collaboration, and other opportunities that help them succeed in practicing cancer control work through an environmental and an occupational health lens, and vice versa. And so to introduce our two wonderful speakers today, I would like to introduce you all to our task force staff lead, Caroline Powell.
Thanks, Kelly, and welcome everyone. Like Kelly said, my name is Caroline Powell. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the staff lead for our Cancer and the Environment Task Force. And I have the privilege of introducing two people whom I personally look up to for their work in occupational and environmental health spaces in Iowa. So first up, we've got Rich Gassman, who is the director of Iowa's Center for Agricultural Safety and Health, or ICASH. And Rich grew up on a family farm in Northeast Iowa and has spent most of his career working in agricultural health and safety, where he has initiated, launched, monitored, and reviewed safety and health programs for multi-site corporations and organizations. He received his BS in agronomy from Iowa State University and his MS in occupational safety and health from the University of Iowa. And next, we'll hear from Audrey Tran Lam, who is the Environmental Health Program Manager for the Center for Energy and Environmental Education at the University of Northern Iowa. In this role, she oversees two statewide public health education initiatives, Good Neighbor Iowa and Farming for Public Health, and she also facilitates the Pesticides and Public Health Working Group. She holds a master's degree in public health from the University of Iowa and a graduate certificate from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in food systems, the environment, and public health. So two really awesome speakers on the lineup for us. And with that, I will pass it over to Rich.
Wow, what an introduction. You're starting to make me feel special here. Well, first off, thank you. I truly appreciate the opportunity. You know, anytime we can get a chance to tell the story about safety in agriculture or in the health of agriculture, we're going to take that opportunity. And what a wonderful audience to have today. So, you know, whenever you're preparing something like this, you're never quite sure how to prepare it. So if it seems a little bit mundane, let me know afterwards so I can fix it. But that I'm technologically challenged. So Caroline's going to be changing the slides for me today. So let's do that right now, Caroline. All right, a little bit about ICASH and who we are and what we do. So in 1990, the state of Iowa legislature recognized the need. They knew that there were some issues going on in agriculture and the safety and health world, and they wanted to do something about it. From that session, you know, Iowa Center for Ag Safety and Health was born. It's really a unique setup that we have here. There are roughly 12 ag safety and health centers scattered throughout the US. All but one of them is NIOSH funded. So we are not NIOSH funded. We are funded by the state of Iowa. We're a line item in the budget every year. Which, as you know, as a director, makes it really nice because I don't have to do any of the fundraising and some of those types of things and grant writing. But the other thing that makes us unique is that we are a collaborative effort. So we are part of Iowa, University of Iowa, Iowa State University, um, Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, and then the Iowa Department of Health and Human Services. We are housed at the University of Iowa. I get asked that question a lot. Why there? Your agriculture? Why not Iowa State? College of Public Health and hospitals. That's why we're at the University of Iowa. We have a fantastic team, and we do a lot of really good things. Some of the things we're working on right now, right in the middle of what's called one of our seasonal campaigns. This campaign is focusing on youth workers in agriculture. So we're sending a lot of material out to all of our extension, county extension folks, as well as our FSA folks. That's always a big project. This one here happens to be bigger than most because we sent a lot of material. We're getting ready for AMRASH. AMRASH is the Midwest Rural Agricultural Safety and Health Conference that we host every year. If you're so inclined, it is November 6th through the 8th in Ames. And there's more information at the end when I'm done. So one of the other really big things that we're working on right now, and I'm actually really thrilled to be a part of, is a project called Relationships Can Heal. And what we're doing there is I'm working with Dr. David Brown and Tim Christensen from ISU Extension, and we're presenting to mental health professionals in the state of Iowa on how to work with and talk with our agricultural producers. It's a different group, and a lot of the things that typically work may or may not work with them, and a lot of things we talk about are what they should and shouldn't say, and some things like that. So that's about it. Let's go on to the next one. All right, we'll talk a little bit about the health and safety issues that we see in agriculture. This is nowhere near an exhaustive list. I tried to hit some of the highlights of the things that we see, and understanding that this is the Cancer Consortium hit some of those things as well. So we got tractors, slip, trips, and falls, skin cancer, and pesticide exposure. All right, let's move to the next one. All right, one of the things I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the risk factors that we see when we're working in agriculture. It helps us kind of define who we're dealing with and the best way to effectively communicate with them. Most farmers, and I'll be honest, I was one, as Caroline said in the intro, I was born and raised on a farm in Northeast Iowa. I've been involved in it for a long time. There's always this perceived sense of urgency. The rain's coming, it's always coming. We do a lot of different, so we tend to take some shortcuts. Just the very nature of the job puts us with prolonged exposure to the sun. We're working outside all the time. I think back when I was a kid, it didn't matter how hot or cold it was, we were outside. And the last one is one that I like to include because it helps us understand who we're dealing with. So there's this thing out there called the agrarian myth, and there's many different definitions of what the agrarian myth is. But it portrays farmers as the bedrock of democracy and that they're willing to sacrifice for the better of society. And to some degree, I think that's very, very accurate. The farmers that I work with take it very, very seriously, the fact that they raise food. They raise food for the entire population. The last number I looked at, it was around 155 people each farmer in Iowa is feeding. They take that very seriously, and they will do whatever they need to make sure that gets done. So kind of keep that in mind as you're dealing with folks in agriculture. Okay, next slide. All right, tractors. Tractors still are currently the leading cause of injury and death on farms. Tractor rollovers, we see a lot of those. Nationally, about 130 people die every year from tractor rollovers. And Iowa leads the nation in that number. Not a number that we're proud of. Also a number that we could easily fix with rollover protective structures. About half the tractors in the state of Iowa do not have rollover protective structures on them, and we could put them, we could get them put on, and we could reduce a lot of fatalities. PTOs, power takeoff shafts, we still see people getting caught in those. That's what powers most of the equipment that we pull. The number of tractor runovers, we're seeing that go down. It used to happen a lot more when we could start tractors from the ground. Not seeing that so much anymore. But one that is staying constant is the roadway incidents. We're seeing a lot of roadway incidents. He's, somewhat, and I've been in tractors that have been hit by other vehicles and things like that. We try to do our best with the lighting and the marking, and we always tell people just to pay attention and be aware of their surroundings. All right, next one, Caroline. Slip, strips, and falls, and we'll just highlight this one a little bit. Falls from height, falling off of anything. Believe it or not, most of the falls are off of tractors. People falling from tractors and getting hurt, or falling from grain bins or other things. Much more common though is falls on the same level. Think about any farm that you've seen or that you've been on. Lots of things to trip over, lots of dark areas, lots of tall weeds and things with things hiding in them. So we end up seeing that. Not to mention, like I said before, our agricultural population is aging. The average age is 56.6 now, or 57.6 years old now. So we all know as we get older and we fall, more things happen. So all right, next one, Caroline. All right, a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and we'll talk a little bit about skin cancer. Actually, talk quite a bit about skin cancer. Right now, I'm helping my dad. My dad's 84 years old, but he has got some skin cancer going on. Actually, a lot of skin cancer going on. He's being treated down at the University of Iowa. But I think back to when I was a kid. He always had short sleeve shirts on. Very rarely do we see him with shorts and no shirt. But he's dealing with a fair amount of skin cancer on his legs and on his arms, the things that were somewhat exposed. So when we do our trainings with skin cancer, or ways to prevent skin cancer, a lot of the things, the usual things that we talk about, the wide brimmed hats, we can all wear those. Long sleeve shirt and pants, and I do, when I'm outside, I do tend to wear long sleeve shirts. I do a lot of fly fishing. We're out in the sun a lot. And I have some long sleeve, especially with the newer fabrics that we have out there. Sunglasses with UV protection, very, very important thing that we do. But then sunscreen, we can't talk about that enough. I was at a presentation here in Dubuque a couple weeks ago by one of the dermatologists at the clinic here in town. And one of the things that she said that I found was very, very interesting was, look at your shadow. If your shadow is shorter than you are, we're exposed to higher levels of UV radiation. I thought that was kind of interesting because we can all see that as we go. There's other underlying conditions that we in agriculture look at. Iowa has the second highest rate of new cancers. Plus, we also have a fairly high per capita alcohol consumption. And from what we've been reading, those two together are going to, create some issues as well. So yeah. All right, next one. All right, pesticide exposure. I've been involved in this world for a long time. Spent many years actually spraying these products. One of the things, when we do these trainings, and Iowa State does a wonderful job with these trainings, a lot of the things that we talk about is being able to understand the label. Read the label, make sure you understand the label, and also make sure you understand the SDS. Those two documents are going to give you everything you need to know to protect yourself. Understand what your PPE requirements are. Understand what we need to wear to make sure that we're protecting ourselves. also understand, and this is one of the things that I used to preach to my teams when we were involved in this, is understand what the wind speeds are. Know where they are and know what conditions are going to cause us to have pesticides move off to where they're not supposed to be. Temperature inversions, high humidity, lots of wind, those types of things were things that we worked on a lot, just to make sure, none of us wanted a exposure application. So, all right, next slide. I think that's about done. All right, how can you all help us? That's really what we need. What are some things that you can do for us that'll help us, spread the word? When you're talking to producers, let them know that you care about them, that you're worried about their safety and health. Make sure that you're understanding the needs of the farmer. One of the things that we hear a lot, and I used to get asked this question all the time: how many acres do you farm? Don't ask that question. That's like asking a farmer what's in their bank account. We don't like to answer that. My response to whenever I got asked that question was all of them. The other thing, a question I used to get was how many people work for you, and I said about half of them. So, got to have a little bit of fun too when we were doing that. So make sure you're understanding who they are, what they're doing, and why they're doing what they're doing. So, all right, next one. All right, there's my contact information and a little blurb for MRASH if you're so inclined to come and see it. So.
Thanks, Rich. And we'll have time for a Q&A after Audrey's presentation, probably a little fireside chat too, because I love hearing from Audrey and Rich. So I'm going to stop sharing and let Audrey get set up.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Rich. That was a great presentation. We did practice this, but it's still early in the hour, so it's probably plenty of time for me to encounter some technical difficulties with my screen share. Caroline, do you want to confirm for me that I've got the right view up for you?
It's looking good.
Oh, such a relief to hear. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for allowing me to entertain your attention for a little while. Like Caroline said, my name is Audrey Tran Lam. I oversee the environmental health programs at the University of Northern Iowa Center for Energy and Environmental Education. My aims today for this talk is to hopefully very quickly cover some of the most compelling evidence on alternative cropping systems that have significant impacts to downstream health, both ecological health and human health. My sort of happy place in my work is the overlap of ecological sustainability and human health. So where those things mesh together is really what I get excited about working on and talking about the evidence for. So hopefully we can get through this relatively quickly, because I definitely am interested in hearing your questions and hearing from you. One of the reasons why I wanted to cover some of the most compelling evidence, as I see it, on alternative cropping systems is, I think, some of the hardest parts of my job is when I am communicating with our peers in public health, to hear from our colleagues that they are completely unaware that evidence for different cropping systems that are much less sort of environmentally, have a smaller environmental footprint, they're unaware that this evidence exists. And so it's something that I really enjoy talking about, letting people know that alternatives exist, they're being practiced today, it's profitable, and we have examples of innovative farmers putting the evidence into practice across Iowa today. Okay, so that's a little bit of a preamble for you. And I'm going to move forward here and attempt to move forward here and tell you a little bit about our center first. So the Center for Energy and Environmental Education on the University of Northern Iowa's campus, it's a outreach and engagement center. So we don't do research here, but we translate existing evidence into practice in communities across the state. So really that putting science into action, acting on what we know to improve both ecological sustainability and, in the case of my environmental health programs, human health. We're a resource to all Iowans and to some extent to the region on topics of energy conservation, local foods, and environmental health. So that makes up the expertise of the staff at the center. My environmental health program has three main initiatives. the Good Neighbor Iowa program, which is an urban pesticide reduction program and an urban pesticide education program, our Farming for Public Health program, which is also a statewide education campaign focused on many of the topics that I'll be talking about today. And then our Climate Toxics program, which I mean, is so new, it like almost maybe shouldn't be counted as an initiative yet. But since I have a website now, I feel like I should at least mention that it exists. This program is all about providing consumers and Iowans really information on how to sort of vet personal care products so that they can reduce their toxic load in their everyday life, and also to connect the dots between chemicals and climate and how they have sort of a fossil energy footprint that is pretty significant. So that can be found on our CEEE website. Really, our programs at the center, especially the environmental health program, is really focused on that upstream systems thinking. We really want to support communities across the state to actually get things done, to put that science, like I said, into action. Okay. So extremely grateful to Alicia for, one, going first in this amazing series, and two, for laying out so much of the considerations that we have when it comes to agriculture and human health, especially from a water quality perspective. If you missed that presentation, highly recommend that you go check that one out. It covers a lot of what I think I would have said about water quality. So I think I'll just highlight a couple points and then add a few of my own for sort of the rationale for why we're even talking about this in the context of public health and cancer risk. So Alicia mentioned nutrient loss, right, and how it can result in harmful algal blooms. That definitely does have impacts to our ability to recreate in our Iowa waters and waterways. But then also the compelling evidence that links nitrate levels at rates lower than the EPA's MCL in drinking water that have been linked to some concerning cancer outcomes. The evidence looks like about half of the MCL being 10 parts per million of nitrates in drinking water are attributed to some cancer risk. It's a little concerning, a chronic low dose over time. What Alicia didn't mention, and that I'm sort of obsessed with in my work, is the connection between soil health, decreased soil health, and the severity of flooding events downstream. There was a really amazing report by the Union of Concerned Scientists called Turning Soils into Sponges that I have really all of my students read at the center, those who work for me and those that I guess have to suffer through a semester with me talking about soil, farming, human health, and water quality. So I would highly, highly recommend this read. The executive summary is really short, and I learned a lot from it. And honestly, it fueled a lot of my obsession with soil health and its relationship to public health. But as certain farming systems have really taken hold across the state and the region, we've noticed not only soil loss, but a decrease in soil quality, which doesn't have sort of that robust ability to hang on to water, both in times of excess rainfall and in times of drought. And as we know from earlier this year, these major flooding events across the state have severe impacts to access to care, whether that's living with chronic disease. Maybe you can't get to a dialysis clinic. Maybe you don't have electricity to store your insulin. Maybe you can't get to a follow-up appointment. Maybe you can't get to your cancer screening appointment. And what happens to those people in the loss to follow-up during these massive upheavals in overflowing riverbanks? The other thing that I would be remiss if I didn't touch on is this pesticide issue. I facilitate the Pesticides and Public Health Working Group here in Iowa, and so this is a topic of interest of me especially. 53 million pounds of herbicides are applied in Iowa annually, and that number is actually 3 million pounds higher than the last time I gave a talk like this. I just looked up the statistics on the USDA website, and so annually it looks like we apply 53 million pounds of herbicide to Iowa watersheds every year. This number, 53 million, it does not include insecticides. It does not include fungicides. And so this is just a snippet of what is going into the state, albeit a pretty large snippet, since herbicides are definitely the largest pesticide class that we use in Iowa. I like to mention this because, connecting the dots between weed resistance in Iowa and in farm fields across the region and the Midwest really is and is becoming more of a public health problem. As weeds are becoming more and more resistant to some of the newer and honestly more benign pesticide technologies, farmers need to rely on a mixture of pesticides and chemistries to take out some of these weeds, or older pesticide technologies and chemistries. And those older chemistries are typically more toxic and hazardous to both human health and ecological health. And there's a lot that we don't know about how mixtures of chemicals interact with each other, though there is some emerging evidence that there are some synergies that are kind of concerning, especially with insecticides and fungicides. We also know that drift is a pretty big problem in the Midwest. It has implications for occupational health, for economic viability of some farms, organic and otherwise, those not using sort of GMO protective seeds. And of course, there are some health concerns that I would want to mention just very briefly. There was a study that came out earlier this year, actually, that found that dicamba detects in pregnant women, sort of compared over two cohorts, one in 2010 to 2012, compared to a cohort of pregnant women in 2020 and 2022 through 2022, found that detects of dicamba in their urine increased 70%. Now, like there's still a question about what this means. Does this exposure necessarily equate to negative public health harms? We don't know, because we're just now getting around to asking these questions. But we do know that in utero and early life exposure to toxics and or hormonally active chemicals can have long-term impacts to the exposed individual. We have historical examples of this, right? DDT, for example, the synthetic hormone DES given to pregnant women sort of resulted in birth defects, certain cancers later down the road for those babies. And other early life in utero exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals are excellent case studies of how sort of these low dose exposures during these critical windows of development have not been super great in long-term health outcomes. So while we're still learning about the specifics of the potential harms of what this might mean in terms of this dicamba exposure, we know that significant harm was caused from past historical examples. So it's a little concerning there, and something that I am very interested in learning more about in my role at the center. Okay, moving forward here. One of the main points of this talk, like I said at the start of my presentation, is that I really like sharing the information that I don't know if many of our colleagues in public health know about. And that is the typical farming cropping system practiced in the Midwest is inherently leaky. A corn soy rotation or a corn on corn rotation is going to leach nutrients. It's inherent in the system. And so even the most conscientious farmer is going to lose a certain amount of soil, a certain amount of nutrients, some chemical lost to the environment, and that does equate to a loss of some money. The solutions to this system, sort of holding in those nutrients, some of which Alicia shared last week, they're typically a little bit more focused on downstream, somewhat reactive. So like putting in that buffer strip or doing things that are a little downstream to catch that nutrients. And so in terms of sort of our public health training, I wish that we could think a little bit more upstream in that, because it's a little bit more reactive than I think many of us in this field are used to thinking. So I want to present one of the sort of like the most amazing, I think, trials done in Iowa, looking at alternative cropping systems and what that means for nutrient retention. So the Marsden Farm experiment has been going on since 2001. It's a 22-acre experimental plot in Boone County, Iowa. It compares 2-year corn soybean systems managed sort of with conventional rates of mineral fertilizers and herbicides against a more diverse 3- and 4-year cropping system managed with lower rates of agrochemicals. And important to note that this is not an organic system that the 2-year rotation is being compared against. They're still using agrochemicals. The need is just far less. And before I continue, I think it's important to give many of us who are not in farming or agricultural practice a little primer on what a rotation actually means. So this is a really helpful slide that I've stolen lovingly from Dr. Matt Liebman, who was at the university, or Iowa State University, in the Sustainable Agronomy Department. The far left block that illustrates a 2-year rotation shows, maybe we can say the yellow part is corn and the green part is soy. This middle box shows yellow corn, green soy, and then a small grain in oats. This is a 3-year rotation, just sort of splitting up the field, the same farm field, into different crops. And a 4-year rotation might add alfalfa to the end of that. A rotation just means year 2, everything shifts over. The 2-year rotation would alternate where the soy and the corn is. Years 3 and year 4 just sort of shifts over what was planted. So instead of corn, soy, oats on the 3-year rotation, the second year would be soy, oats, and then corn. So that's what I mean by a 2, 3, and 4-year rotation. These extended rotations, the 3 and 4, is what the Marsden farm trials were comparing against this 2-year rotation. All right, I know I'm going really quickly. Hopefully you'll be able to view this recording later if you'd like to take any more notes, because this slide gets a little busy but has a lot of really great information. I'm gonna super quickly summarize some of the highlights here. But the long-term trial of the Marsden farm showed that during this 10-year period, this 2006 to 2016 period, the mineral fertilizer use on the extended crop rotations were 86 and 91% lower than in the 2-year rotation, and herbicide use was 96 and 97% lower. That's pretty darn close to 100%. That's pretty amazing. Corn yields were a little bit higher, 4% higher. Soybean yields were 16% higher in the more diverse systems. The incidence and severity of some diseases in soy were much lower. There are 3 indicators of soil health that were much higher in the extended rotations, which likely helped boost those yields in the earlier bullet point I summarized. The spring concentrations of nitrates in drainage water collected from the more diverse systems were 57% lower than in the 2-year cropping system, and soil erosion was 50% lower, fossil energy consumption was 60% lower, and freshwater toxicity associated with herbicide use was 93% lower in the more diverse systems than in conventional systems. So, like, what we're seeing here is, I think, really well-documented evidence that adding more biodiversity to the land has a lot of really incredible downstream impacts to soil health, to water quality, to reduction in chemical inputs, both synthetic fertilizer and in herbicide application. And if you remember from my earlier slide, herbicides is where the bulk of that chemical application comes in when we're talking about pesticides. Nowhere on this slide does it talk about the economics, so this is what this slide is for, just to break out some concerns that some folks have when it comes to transitioning into an extended crop rotation. The economic feasibility is there. They've done some economic analysis on the Marsden farm and found that the 3 and 4-year rotations do come in pretty close to what the 2-year rotations are pulling in terms of dollars per acre. This is likely after a transition period, because those early transition years, there is a little bit of a risk that a farmer takes on to change their system, absolutely. And so that is definitely one barrier that we could talk about towards the end of this presentation in terms of adoption of maybe moving into more diverse cropping systems. One last study that I think is a nice one to highlight, since we were talking about fossil energy use earlier, is this really great study here done by a lot of the same folks involved in some of the Marsden experiments. I've highlighted a couple of important lines from the abstract that I'll read, I think, to you all. FE, which here means fossil energy consumption, it was about half, a little over half, that in the 3-year and 4-year rotations and the 2-year rotations, and greenhouse gas emissions pretty much followed suit. They were just over halved. Diversification on the fields reduced combined monetized damages from greenhouse gases and PM 2.5 related emissions by 42 and 57%. It's something I didn't mention about the study, which is really cool, is that it actually looked in dollar amounts the harms in terms like public health harms. So it looked at sort of dollars that were being spent or how do I say this, looked at the public health related harms in dollars when it came to less diverse cropping systems compared to more diverse cropping systems. This final line here reads, results suggest that diversification via shifting from conventional corn soybean rotations to longer rotations with small grain and forage crops substantially reduce fossil energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, and air quality related damages without compromising economic or agronomic performance, which is extremely important. I think it's relevant to the conversation we're having about cancer prevention and cancer risk here in Iowa to talk about greenhouse gas emissions and air quality damages, because we know that some of these criteria are pollutants in greenhouse gas emissions, and PM 2.5 are increasing cancer risk, can contribute to cancer risk, and the combination of those chemicals are in fact a carcinogen. So I think it's really important to think about sort of the life cycle of downstream impacts, downwind air impacts as well. Okay, just so we can leave maybe on a more positive note, I want to highlight some Iowa activities as it comes to this really important research. The farming systems that require both less and fewer inputs are being put into practice here in Iowa, really following suit from this research from ISU and the Rodale Institute. The Marsden Farm, like I said, that experiment has been going for 23 years now. The Rodale farming system trial has been going for 40 years. So we have a really robust library of data now that shows that these farming systems are possible, practical, and can be practiced in these regions. Farmers across the state, like I said earlier, are putting these things into practice, and you can find a lot of these farmers involved at PFI, Practical Farmers of Iowa, where a lot of peer-to-peer sharing is occurring so that we can disseminate the research and the practices of individual farmers and how it works on their farms. And I also want to highlight the Iowa Food System Coalition and their work in putting together the Iowa Food Plan entitled Setting the Table for All Iowans. It's a wonderful document. It was just released and finally published earlier this year in June that actually outlines a plan for how the food system in Iowa can look to support health in all forms, and including sustainability practices like on-farm practices I shared. So as quickly as I can get through all of that, because I really want to have a discussion with you all. I want to just highlight one final thought, which is, we have enough evidence to make positive change on the landscape in Iowa. There are definitely questions that we still need answers to, but that shouldn't stop us from putting the things that we know into practice, the really excellent research that's already been done. So I'm going to drop my email into the chat so you all have a way of getting a hold of me. I thank you again for your attention, and thank you, Caroline, for the invitation to present.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you, Rich. Virtual round of applause. And now it's time for Q&A. So feel free to use the chat to drop any questions you may have, or unmute. So I'll give it a sec if folks have any questions. I know one question that came up. Rachel wanted to know if, where'd it go? Oh, there we go. Did the farm in the study you mentioned have livestock, Audrey?
It did not, but the 3- and 4-year cropping rotations did occasionally have manure application.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, go ahead, Melinda. You might be on mute. You should be able to unmute, but let me know if.
Sorry about that.
No.
So I think I want to get to something that Rich said, and it had to do with temperature inversions and high temperatures. So I live in Missouri, just south of Iowa, and you really cannot drive through the rural countryside, whether you're talking about Missouri, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, during certain times of the summer without getting a horrific stench. So I have a little property actually along a river, and just last weekend tried to enjoy my time there with my canoe. And I guess there was a temperature inversion because the temperature dropped in the evening and we had to close our windows and basically left the next day. We could not be there. We have the privilege to leave. But for the children and for the families that have to live in that constant stench of those herbicides, maybe it's different in Iowa, but I don't think there is any way or any recourse for people who live, in these regions where you can't help but smell it, therefore ingest it. This is the way that farmers farm. They spray their soybeans. Good luck fighting that.
I'm not sure how to answer this. Having worked in that world for a long time, usually herbicides, insecticides, the smell doesn't last very long. It's usually, once it dries, you usually don't smell it much anymore. So I guess I'm not sure. It'd be hard for me to answer your question without knowing what was being applied in the area.
Well, we know what's being applied to soybeans, right? They're spraying glyphosate plus either 2,4-D or dicamba. And this particular incident, I don't know about you in Iowa, but easily it lasts for days where you can smell this. Whether it's, the temperature is too high. I mean, we in Missouri, we have 80 plus degrees in May, easily early May. So even though farmers need to be aware, I mean, how do you predict a temperature inversion? Would they not spray because they know that the temperature is going to be 80 something? They feel like they have to get those beans sprayed. So what would you tell a rural community that is suffering through this stench? Where do they go to restrict the use of these herbicides? Because clearly they are contaminating or fouling the air.
I don't have a good answer for you. Audrey, anything from you?
I was just thinking a little bit about sort of the good news, hopefully long-lasting good news about the over-the-top dicamba use being restricted in soybeans now because of the intense volatility of that chemical. Like Melinda was saying, dicamba is an extremely volatile chemical, and especially in high temperatures, it doesn't like to stay put. So volatility in this case would mean a farmer would spray it or an applicator would spray it, and it simply wouldn't stay down. It would volatilize off of the soy and sort of be available to drift to a different field to impact areas surrounding wherever it was applied. Because of the increased volatility, the EPA pulled sort of the over-the-top use of this chemical. It doesn't necessarily mean that that won't change in the future. And it hasn't been restricted in like lawn use, which we know dicamba is also being used in urban spaces. So I don't think I also have a very good answer for you, Melinda, except that like it's I know that this is a problem since there are more acres that need to be applied with chemical than there are appropriate weather days for the application. So farmers and applicators are being put into a really bad position with unpredictable weather patterns to have to spray the acres of the crops that they have paid for the GMO seed to be paired with the chemical. So there is a pressure that is really unfair for the applicators and the farmers. But yeah, like I don't have a good answer for you either.
Yeah, I know it's a tragic situation.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't used to be like this.
No, I think tragic is a good word for it.
Thanks, Melinda. Any other questions? Oh, well, Rachel mentioned you may want to connect with your local health department to see what air quality monitoring resources they have available. So that might be an option. And I think what we're getting to as well is something that Charlotte mentioned in the chat. It's just like the importance of messaging and information in rural communities. So this was a plug for the MRASH conference because they're talking about what has worked and not worked in safety messaging, and then new ideas as well as information on AI. So I did have a question concerning messaging. I was just curious, when you're working with agricultural communities, like what messaging source works best for this safety and health information? Like, is it helpful to have it come from a public health department? Is it helpful to have it come from an org like the consortium or an extension office or a hospital? Like, where are people turning for this information?
Some of the things that we're seeing, the message has to come from some of their trusted sources. And what we're seeing is healthcare is a trusted source for them. Also, as we're seeing more and more young folks get involved, the social media aspect and working with different social media platforms to try to get the message out, I know has been very effective.
That's great to hear, Rich. I wish I had a better answer for this question, Caroline. I typically do most of my communication outreach to our peers in public health. And so I would definitely look to Rich to the answer to that question. I will, however, say that we have had really wonderful conversations with farmer groups, farmer-led groups like the one I mentioned earlier, Practical Farmers of Iowa, that do a lot of that peer-to-peer interfacing that really help farmers share what's working for them in terms of alternate farming practice, but also sort of the rationale for why they might want to change their farming practice. For example, concerns about their health or their family's health.
And this is one of the questions those of us in the safety world have been battling forever. Not just agriculture and everything that we do. What type of messaging and what messaging platform is the best one? And I think the answer to that is all of them. It's a combination of all of them and making sure that we're getting that message out and making sure that we're getting it out in a way that people understand.
Yeah, I like how you said, like, it's one thing to have the information available for people, but it has to be readable and relatable. And so I'm just curious, if you've seen any messaging, like any examples of like what has worked, like with sun safety, for example. Like, do pictures work? Like, if you see someone, like the person in the field next to you wearing a hat, are they more inclined to wear the hat? Like, what have you seen? Like, what's been effective, I guess?
Things that I've seen that are effective are mostly, a lot of photos of the right way to do things. Whatever the right way may be, it's the right way to do things. I think a lot of it too is getting our ag suppliers on board. You don't see a lot of seed corn companies. I won't pick on any of them, but seed corn companies, giving out wide brimmed hats. You're starting to see it now. You're starting to see more and more of it, but for a long time we didn't see much of that. I know in our seasonal campaign we sent packets of sunscreen. Just giving people the opportunity to see those things. So
that's a great point too about getting like suppliers on board, because one thing that I think Rich and Audrey, you both have done really well in this presentation is show us that there are individual actions like wearing the proper PPE, but there's also like those systemic or organizational actions as well, and like studies and research that can be done to support promoting safer agriculture in the state. So thank you for that. Anyone have any other questions, compliments? Perfect. Thanks, Laura. So Rich and Audrey, what kinds of policies exist at the national, state, or local level that can reduce exposures of farm workers to environmental carcinogens?
This one's always a tricky one to answer. So agriculture is exempt from OSHA enforcement. Within reason, I mean, there are, 10, if you have more than 10 non-family members, then you're not exempt, but most of them that we see here in Iowa are going to be exempt. Plus, it's kind of a gray area. So there really isn't any, there's a lot of groups such as Audrey's group and some of the others that are working on this and that are really doing a lot of really good work. And I'll let her talk more about that. But you know, from a regulatory standpoint, there isn't a whole lot out there.
Yeah, I would have to second that, echo that concerning statement. There's not a lot to protect farmers specifically from carcinogens that they may encounter on the job. You know, I really like to talk about, I don't like to talk about the lack of policy that exists for protecting these occupational settings and these communities surrounding these occupational settings. Instead, I really like to focus on the tenets really of our center, which is we don't have to wait for that policy to be enacted in order to sort of like make things better for these communities, for these settings, for these farmers. However, like that being said, sometimes that's not enough. Without those policy guardrails, like these safer practices just may not occur. I want to, though, like I really like drawing the analogy between sort of like the evidence as we knew it when it pertained to secondhand smoke in public places. How much evidence we had to amass before public policy stepped in and say, like, yeah, we shouldn't be smoking in public places. And prior to that, we could smoke on the bus, smoke on the plane, smoke in a restaurant. We are reaching that place when it comes to chemicals in the environment and sort of these hazardous occupational settings that certain populations, vulnerable populations, find themselves in. I don't think we really want to wait much longer than we have to act on what we already know. And so I think that we can, as communities, make decisions and not wait for policy to be enacted. And we also, as citizens, can have a larger voice in crafting the policies that we want to see, that we know will help keep our community members safe. Not a super satisfying answer, I know, but that's sort of the reality of the landscape as it is right now.
Thanks, Audrey. So Jennifer had a really good question. With 40% of corn and 70% of soy being fed to animals in the concentrated operations, oh, I forgot what CAFOs stand for. I talk about them all the time. But
confined animal feeding operations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any pollution studies that include pasture in rotation or the effects of returning animals to pasture?
Okay, this is an excellent question. I can't off the top of my head reference any studies for you, but there are wonderful groups working on this topic. So if a great resource would be the Carbon Farmers. It looks a group of farmers, I believe they're in Canada, that do rotational grazing to raise livestock, but then also to sort of lower their carbon footprint and to not have animals in those really confined operations. Tree range farming, it's free range chickens that live in trees up in Minnesota. The gentleman's name who farms them is escaping me right now, but he's really wonderful. We have examples of farmers in Iowa that are practicing sort of this non-CAFO style animal raising. Seth Watkins is a really excellent example in his farm, Pinhook Farms, down in Southwest Iowa. Johns Hopkins has done really amazing work looking at CAFOs and their impacts to the environment. So I would check out their Center for a Livable Future. They would very likely have a readily accessible bibliography of resources to answer the question that you're asking that I unfortunately can't regurgitate for you right now. Sorry.
Thanks, Audrey. I guess that did remind me of a question I had for Rich. Do you ever work with like livestock or poultry workers at all, or is it mainly like row crop farmers that you do like health and safety for, or are there any differences with the health and safety?
We pretty much work with everybody across the board on what they're doing. In the past, I've done some work with the Hutterite communities, and we would love to do more. How's that?
Yeah, good answer. Thanks, Rich. All right, we've got 5 minutes left, and I know, Rich, you mentioned this in your slide, but I do want to cover this question one more time, since a lot of the folks on this call are cancer control or public health professionals. I'm just curious, for you both, what role do you see cancer control and public health professionals playing in promoting safer agriculture and getting more involved, in rural health?
Go first. Get us get us information, get us research studies that show that we can do this. Help us work with you. That's what we're always, what we're always looking for. One of the things that we really try to do, especially with my group, is creating these group adventures, we call them. Let's get everybody involved and let's try to make sure that we're getting the message out where it needs to be in the format that it needs to be in.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I would totally echo that. I would also say, please keep coming to talks like this. It may feel like it's, several degrees of separation from sort of your focus. Like, what does this have to do with cancer control, cancer prevention? What does this have to do with my patient population or the topics that I'm interested in? I think that until you sort of have a little bit of a knowledge under your belt, it seems really far away and not related until you realize, like, oh, actually, this may have direct and indirect implications to the communities that I serve. And so I think knowing a little bit also helps you feel a little less helpless. Your voice really does matter in these conversations, especially with your sort of medical credentialing and allied health credentialing. It really is important to weigh in on these conversations. I started the presentation saying that some of the most heartbreaking conversations that I have with my colleagues in the public health space is when they tell me, like, I actually didn't know that any of this evidence existed. I'm not aware of the evidence that says that alternative farming practices exist, and it could have real implications, very significant reductions of nitrates and pesticides in our waterways and our watersheds. So, please keep being curious, and please never hesitate to reach out to me, to reach out to us, to have these conversations so that we can also help you in connecting those dots. But yeah, using your voice and your credentialing to stand up for these rural communities and for these occupational settings that, aren't as well protected would be my answer.
Both great answers. So just want to say thank you so much again, Rich and Audrey, for taking the time out to share your knowledge. Another virtual round of applause. Feel free to leave compliments in the chat. We love compliments here. But just thank you so much again. And so if folks want to learn more, like Audrey said, we've got 2 more parts of our webinar series. Part 3 will be on minimizing plastics use, which is a topic we have not covered much. I know Audrey's excited, but it'll be good. So you can join us on August 6th for that, and I'll drop the link in the chat. But with that, thank you all so much for attending. Thank you again, Rich and Audrey, and we will see you all on the 6th.